Black Labor, White Wealth by Dr. Claude Anderson. The slave codes reinforce the public policy, giving it substance and statutory authority. In the South, the policy gave rise to a unique racial code of etiquette that prescribed the status, role, and expected behavior for both blacks and whites. The new racial etiquette gave respectability to the policy. Laws were enacted that required newspapers, businesses, and social organizations to be ever mindful of the policy and to publicize the code of etiquette. Often clergymen were required to read both of them to their congregations. The primary purpose of the code of etiquette was to support the public policy on the use of blacks by requiring that all whites act superior to blacks at all times and that blacks give deference to whites and act inferior to them at all times. The secondary purpose of the code and public policy was to make it possible for whites to exercise effective control over blacks and to strengthen the sense of white unity. Let's see. Timeline 1915 to 1953. Okay, 1915 to 1954, blacks began 1950 northern migration. All right, 1929, Great Depression began. Black urban ghettos began. 1930, Black cultural renaissance began. 1930. Blacks accepted into unions. 1940, Black political realization. 1949, urban renewal program began. Highway system began destroying black communities. 1954, U.S. Supreme Court desegregation. 1954 desegregation decision. In 1787, the drafters of the U.S. Constitution incorporated the colonial public policy on blacks into the founding documents of the new nation, making it the slaveholders' friend by recognizing and legitimizing black enslavement. The concept of blacks as property and the doctrine of non interference appeared as three interconnected clauses in the Constitution, which, of course, served as the legal basis of the nation. The Constitution declared blacks to be three-fifths of a person prohibited Congress declared blacks to be three-fifths of a person prohibited Congress from outlawing the slave trade for 20 years and bound the states to assist in returning fugitive slaves to their masters. The drafters made it clear that the government was the legal instrument of white society and that it should be powerless to interfere with black enslavement within the states or with foreign slave trading practices. Yet on the other hand, it was also mandated to exercise its full powers to protect the white slaveholders' investments in slave properties. Until the Revolutionary War, the public policy on the use of black labor evolved primarily from the tobacco growing regions supported by commercial interests. The profitability of slavery declined until Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin in 1793. In the midst of Europe's Industrial Revolution, the cotton gin increased the popularity of cotton and black slavery. At the time, wool was the primary fabric because cotton was scarce and generally very expensive. The cotton gin made American produced cotton the king of agricultural products and the primary fabric of the world. This surge in cotton's popularity reshackled blacks to America's plantations. Businesses and industries associated with and dependent upon black slavery sprang up throughout the North and South. The renewed economic dependence on black labor demanded support from the public and private sectors. White society became more dependent than ever on black labor for creating wealth and income. Moreover, it became more determined to keep blacks subordinated, unskilled, non competitive, and excluded from white society. Okay. The Civil War modified the public policy. By the mid 1800s, the North insisted on change in the public policy on black labor because Northern workers could not compete with the uncompensated slave labor of the South. The South refused, and the nation went to war. The national public policy was in limbo from immediately after the national public policy was in limbo from immediately after the Civil War until the late 1890s. During this time, the South had no official labor force or public policy on the use of blacks. Emancipation legally said blacks were no longer personal property. Newly freed slaves sought to break free of the old public policy. They demanded the 40 acres and a mule that had been promised as compensation for their years of unpaid labor. Blacks wanted to leave slavery prepared to be self-sufficient and productive. However, to break free of the old national public policy would require the government to give millions of blacks unused public lands or portions of old southern plantations for homesteading. For the newly freed slaves to be competitive, then they needed quality school systems to help them shake off centuries of forced ignorance. For newly freed slaves to be competitive, they needed quality school systems to help them shake off centuries of forced ignorance. And to protect them from the animosities of their old enslavers and enemies, the newly freed slaves needed legal and police protection since they were never permitted to bear arms. However, blacks received none of these things, because the national public policy on blacks as a labor force was unchanged by the Civil War. Both the North and the South had needs for a low-paid, intellectually non-competitive labor force. In reconciling post-war differences, the North adopted the public policy of its Southern brothers on the treatment of blacks. There was never any serious effort to give blacks any measures of economic independence or to compensate them for their generations of unpaid labor. As a Washington, D.C. paper noted in 1868, it is impossible to separate the question of color from the question of labor, for the reason that the majority of the laborers throughout the southern states are colored people, and nearly all of the colored people are at present laborers. To change blacks' status as laborers would cause changes in society's political and social ordering of acceptability. Thus, the North and the South collectively agreed to continue but modify the basic tenets undergirding the public policy on blacks. The black freedmen were penniless, uneducated, homeless, and friendless in a hostile South. Without land, reparations, or tools, they had little choice except to offer the market their only resource, themselves. As an available, trained, cheap labor force, blacks stepped into a predictable future. The southern states enacted the Black Codes, which revised the national public policy on blacks, forcing them into sharecropping on southern farms under the control of former slave holders. The Black Codes effectively modified the public policy by substituting sharecropping for slavery. It also fixed black people in a subordinate place in the social order and provided white society with a manageable and inexpensive labor force. The principle behind the national public policy remained intact and survives to this day. The public policy during the civil rights era. The latest great change in the national public policy came in the early 1960s and coincided with the civil rights movement, which championed the awakening of black America during what became known as the Decade of Progress. Between 1955 and 1965, blacks won the battle. Between 1950 and 1965. 1955 and 1965. Blacks won the battle to attend white schools, sit at white lunchroom counters, and sit in bus seats that had historically been reserved for whites only. Little notice was given amidst the celebrating to the fact that the income gap between blacks and whites was widening. The two societies were growing more segregated than ever. Blacks were losing their few businesses and disposable incomes to white suburban stores, and black unemployment was beginning to skyrocket. The integration accomplishments of blacks had coincided with the new phase of the public policy on blacks: obsolescence. The integration accomplishments of blacks had coincided with the new phase of public policy on blacks: obsolescence. For the first time in history of the nation, for the first time in the history of the nation, blacks were free from white society's prescribed labor role. Major advances in technology became the magic bullet that freed the larger white society from dependence on black labor. The two groups' newfound freedoms caused major adjustments in black-white relations. White society's shift away from its dependence on black labor was noted by Alvin Toffler in his book Power Shift. Toffler asserted The most important economic development of this lifetime was the use of a new system of creating wealth based no longer on muscles but on minds. Whites began moving towards a colorblind society where new labor saving machines replaced the need for black muscles and sweat. Machines were less offensive and threatening. It was unlikely that new labor it was unlikely that new labor saving machines would champion equality, integration, or civil rights. Instead, new technology provided a bridge from the old world to the new world and freed the dominant white society from its old ways of thinking about race relations, its old ideology, its old its old ideologies, and its public policies. Um, uh, okay. New World technology pushed white society into a public policy for blacks. New World technology pushed white society into a new public policy for blacks. Few unskilled jobs were left in white businesses and industries. Simultaneously, conservative and liberal white politicians alike claimed that since the civil rights movement had succeeded in giving blacks their social and legal rights, there was nothing else anyone could do for blacks. Blacks, therefore, finally free but obsolete, implementing the public policy. Eight major factors appear to have driven the public policy on the use and treatment of blacks across the centuries. One, the European colonies were predisposed by their native culture to have negative feelings about blackness and black people. Two, they established a public edict that was based around a common need that, if resolved, would be beneficial to all members of white society. Three, white society refined and vigorously supported a coherent public policy on blacks that was transmitted from generation to generation through laws and social customs. Four, the policy was codified by official government acts. Five, it was concertedly supported by all levels of government, schools, churches, businesses, and the larger general society. Six, a sense of community acceptability for supporting the public policy was established. Seven, the public policy received total commitment from all segments of the community. Eight, the public policy was continuously promoted and coordinated by institutions and other entities. As a result of these factors, a consensus was reached on how blacks were to be treated. The public policy was expanded and modified incrementally. The adjustment continued over the centuries based upon the broad labor needs of white society. The nature of the modifications can be tracked to some extent by the historical developments of the nation. When the new opportunities and challenges demanded human labor in the agricultural fields of the South, the, the of the South, when the new opportunities and challenges demanded human labor in the agricultural fields of the South, the range lands of the West, the factories of the North, or the military battlefronts all around the globe, the appropriate government or white institution made sure that black labor force was available and in the forefront. So, in the fields, in the rangelands, in the factories, on the battlefronts. Mm. Role of societal institutions. All of the societal institutions supported the established public policy for the use of blacks. The churches, schools, businesses, and governments joined in the alliance against blacks. They were parts they were parts of a larger social network that systematically concentrated power, wealth, authority, and resources in the hands of white society and blacks to a and consigned blacks to a subordinate and exploited status. The churches offered biblical justification for black enslavement, denouncing blacks as heathens and bearing the mark of Ham. They preached the doctrines of white superiority and black inferiority and excluded blacks from or segregated them within the congregations. Within the churches, within the churches founded by blacks, ministers internalized their conditions, taught blacks meekness and resignation, and a nonviolent strategy for gaining access to their rights and white owned and white controlled resources. Okay, table 10, how whites conditioned the blacks they enslaved. Goals, blacks were to. Techniques, blacks were subjected to. Blacks were to. Blacks were subjected to. Okay. They were to be taught discipline, subjected to endless, hard, tedious, dirty labor. Blacks were to be inferior to whites. Blacks were subjected to never seeing any blacks with power. Blacks were to know their place. Blacks were subjected to the color line and Jim Crow. Blacks were to be backward, childlike, subjected to planned ignorance and humiliation. Blacks were to be fearful of master. Blacks were subjected to physical and psychological deprivation. Blacks were to place master above self. Blacks were subjected to denial of humanity and hope. Blacks were subjected to surrender totally. Blacks were to surrender totally. Blacks were subjected to religious humiliation, hopelessness, surrender totally. Blacks were to see whites as superiors. Blacks were subjected to master's reward and punishment system. Blacks were to be totally dependent. Blacks were subjected to impoverishment, marginal existence. Blacks were to be racially divided. Blacks were subjected to destruction of family and racial unity. Ándale pues. All right. The educational institutions carried out their essential purpose of servicing the economic ends of white society. They prepared children to be leaders and masters of their own fate. White youths were taught academic skills, cultural values, and the pragmatic responsibilities of leadership. Uh, the schools passed the schools passed on doctrines of white superiority and black inferiority to both races. Black children suffered centuries of planned ignorance. During slavery, it was illegal to teach blacks to read. Today, today they attend inferior, ill-equipped schools. American businesses played a role in tailoring the national policy on blacks to their wealth building interests. They formulated new economic principles of capitalism that defined blacks as human commodities and their labor as cheap tools to produce great wealth. American government functioned as a guardian of white wealth and power. White society used government power to enhance or maintain their own privileged positions and to reduce the social and economic status and potential of blacks. Government government guaranteed white control over the fruits of black labor and control over the work process. Government guaranteed white control over the fruits of black labor and control over the work process. Government later sustained the inequities by perpetuating the myth of equal opportunity. Once the public policy for blacks was established, all members of the alliance were committed to vigorously supporting it, whatever the cost. A sense of commitment to the policy was a part of the broad sense of white community cohesiveness. Attacks on or violations of the policy anywhere were an offense against the policy everywhere. The South was so committed that its members preferred to secede from the Union and engage in a civil war before altering the policy. Psychological and social conditioning process. The national public policy on blacks was structured to incorporate the psychological and social conditioning process for blacks and whites that evolved over the course of American history. Slaveholders' absolute power over blacks allowed them to operate an efficient and effective slavery conditioning system. Slaveholders constructed internal controls on slaves that minimized the external force necessary to control them. The government provided the environment for the legal framework and allowed the conditioning process to exist and